The little black girl signaled the biker while dozens of engines formed a blockade around the detention wing. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a cold and windy night, in a small town on the outskirts of California, the sirens were deafening. They echoed through the streets like an ominous warning, the red and blue lights flashing, casting an eerie glow over the streets. But inside the detention center, things were even more tense. A little black girl, no more than 10 years old, stood outside the high-security gate, her small figure trembling with fear. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of panic and determination. She was alone, but her resolve was stronger than any fear she could have felt. Earlier that night, she had watched in horror as her brother was dragged into the detention wing by 2 guards. She had tried to stop them, her tiny hands pulling at the sleeves of their uniforms, but she was no match for their strength. Her brother, Jamal, had been taken from her before, but never like this. This time, something was different. She knew it in her bones. She had to do something. But what could she do? She was just a little girl. But she had a plan. Through the chain-link fence, she could see the silhouette of the bikers gathering in the parking lot. Dozens of them, their leather jackets shining under the flickering streetlights. She knew who they were. The Thunder Riders, a motorcycle club that had earned a reputation for standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. They were her last hope. She ran to the side of the fence, her heart pounding in her chest. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, and with all her courage, she signaled. Her small hand raised, waving frantically in the cold night air. The bikers paused, their engines momentarily silent, as they turned to see the girl. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, locked eyes with her. He knew what she needed. The bikers were no strangers to violence or danger. They had dealt with their fair share of criminals and corrupt officials. But they were also fiercely protective of those who couldn't fight for themselves. This little girl, standing alone in the darkness, needed their help. The man, known as Blade, signaled to his crew, and within seconds, the roar of engines filled the air. The bikes started up one by one, the sound of their engines rumbling like thunder as they moved into formation. It was clear. The bikers were ready to take action. As they revved their engines, the girl watched in awe as they lined up, their powerful machines forming a blockade around the detention wing. The air was thick with anticipation. She had no idea how this would end, but she knew one thing. The bikers weren't going to let her down. They were here to fight. They were here to protect. And no matter the cost, they would bring her brother back. As the sound of the engines echoed throughout the facility, the tension inside the detention center was palpable. The gates were now wide open, and Blade, the leader of the Thunder Riders, stood at the front, ready to face whatever came next. The other bikers moved swiftly, taking their positions with military precision. The little girl, still standing behind the fence, clutched the chain link tightly, her heart racing with anticipation. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had no idea how the bikers would handle this situation, but seeing them in action made her believe that they could do anything. Jamal was about to be freed, and nothing was going to stop that. Inside the detention wing, Jamal sat on the edge of his bunk, his mind racing. He had heard the commotion outside, the sound of engines revving, but he couldn't understand what was happening. His pulse quickened, and he stood up, pacing his small cell. What was going on? Why were the bikers here? Had his sister brought them to save him? He didn't know, but the sound of the doors to his cell being unlocked answered his question. The door swung open, and Blade stepped inside, his expression determined. Jamal froze for a second, unsure of what to say, but then Blade spoke. "You're coming with us," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Your sister's outside. We're not letting anyone hurt you anymore." Jamal couldn't believe what he was hearing. His sister was here? He had been so scared, trapped in this place with no way out. But now, with the bikers here, he had hope. He nodded, his legs shaking with relief as he stepped out of the cell. Blade led him down the hall, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. They passed by several guards who glanced up in confusion, not understanding what was happening. But no one made a move to stop them. It was clear that Blade and his crew were in control now. As they reached the main doors, the little girl's eyes locked with Jamal's. She ran toward him, her face lighting up with relief and joy. "Jamal!" she cried, throwing her arms around him. Jamal hugged her tightly, tears filling his eyes. "I knew you would come for me," he whispered. Blade smiled as he watched the reunion. The little girl had shown incredible courage in reaching out for help, and now, thanks to the Thunder Riders, they were going home. But just as they were about to leave, a shout broke through the air. "Stop right there!" A voice yelled from behind them. Blade turned around to see a group of guards rushing toward them, led by the same officer who had been giving them trouble earlier. The officer's face twisted in anger. "You can't just walk out of here with him. He's under our custody." Blade stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're going to want to turn around and walk away." Now, the officer hesitated, clearly not knowing how to react. But the bikers were already in position. Diesel, Storm, and Phantom stood at the gates, their motorcycles roaring to life. There was no way the guards could stop them now. The officer's expression shifted, and he took a step back. "We don't want any trouble," he said reluctantly. "Just take him and go." Blade gave a single nod. "We will. And don't ever forget, we're watching." With that, the bikers formed a protective circle around Jamal and the little girl. They walked out of the detention center and toward their bikes, the guards fading into the background. As the engines roared to life. Again, the bikers revved their bikes, and the convoy surged forward, leaving the detention center behind. Jamal and his sister were finally free. The bikers had kept their promise. But as the convoy sped through the streets, Blade couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. There was still a storm on the horizon. The Serpents, the gang that had been causing so much trouble, were still out there, and Blade knew they would be coming for them. But for now, they had won. Jamal and his sister were safe, and that was all that mattered. As the convoy of motorcycles roared through the quiet streets, the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the highway. Jamal sat on the back of Blade's bike, his arms tightly wrapped around his sister, who clung to him with all her might. The air was cold, but for the first time in a long while, they felt a sense of safety. The Thunder Riders had kept their promise, and they were finally free. But the relief was only temporary. Blade, ever the vigilant leader, could feel the weight of what was coming. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the road behind them. The Serpents weren't far behind, and Blade could already sense the storm brewing. The Serpents had been after Jamal's family for years, and they wouldn't stop until they had revenge. Blade's mind raced with the possibilities of what lay ahead. The convoy pushed forward, the sound of their bikes filling the night air, a constant reminder of the danger they were riding toward. As they neared the outskirts of town, Blade's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Phantom. "They know. The Serpents are already mobilizing." Blade's jaw tightened. It was time. They had to prepare for what was coming, and they had to do it fast. "All right, listen up," Blade called out to the crew through his radio. "We're not stopping until we get to the safe house. Keep your eyes peeled, stay in formation, and don't let anyone out of your sight." The bikers nodded in unison, their faces hard with resolve. They knew the stakes. As they neared the edge of town, Blade led the group onto a winding, dirt road that snaked through the trees. The safe house was only a few miles away, but with every passing second, Blade felt the tension rising. They were almost there, but the Serpents would not let them slip away so easily. As the convoy turned onto the narrow road, Blade's instincts kicked in. He slowed his bike, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was something off about the area. A low hum filled the air, and Blade could hear the distant sound of tires on gravel. They weren't alone. "Hold up," Blade barked into the radio. "We've got company." The bikers immediately pulled to the side of the road, their engines idling as they surveyed the area. Blade's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the Serpents on them, watching from the shadows. They were closing in. Without a word, the bikers spread out, positioning themselves for what was sure to be a fight. The sound of a lone motorcycle approaching broke the silence. Blade's grip tightened on the handlebars as he prepared for whatever was about to happen. The rider came into view, a tall figure cloaked in darkness, his bike's headlights cutting through the trees. "It's them," Blade muttered under his breath. The Serpents had arrived. The biker stopped just a few feet in front of Blade, his face hidden beneath a black helmet. You should have stayed out of this, Blade, the rider growled, his voice muffled through the helmet. Blade didn't flinch. This is bigger than you and me, he replied, his voice steady. You're not getting away with this. The rider let out a low laugh, his voice dripping with menace. We'll see about that. Without warning, the rider revved his engine, and within seconds, a group of serpents appeared from the trees, surrounding the bikers. It was a standoff, and neither side was willing to back down. Blade looked around, sizing up the situation. He had to make a move, but he couldn't risk putting the kids in danger. He turned to his crew. Stay close. We fight on our terms. The Thunder Riders prepared for battle, their eyes locked on the Serpents. It was a fight for survival, and they weren't going to let these bastards take what they had fought so hard to protect. As the tension thickened, the sound of the engines roared again, louder this time, as if the entire forest was coming alive with the noise. Blade knew this was it. They were going to face the Serpents head-on. The fight for their lives had just begun. The sound of engines revving filled the air, the deep growl of the motorcycles growing louder as the standoff intensified. The Serpents had formed a circle around the Thunder Riders, their bikes casting long shadows under the moonlight. The tension was thick, a silent battle of wills. Blade, his eyes locked on the leader of the Serpents, tightened his grip on the handlebars. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in the air. This wasn't just a fight for Jamal's freedom. This was a fight for survival. This ends tonight, Blade said, his voice calm but firm. You're not taking anyone else. The leader of the Serpents, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, chuckled darkly. You think you can just waltz in here, ride through our territory, and walk out with that kid? He sneered, gesturing toward Jamal, who was sitting behind Blade, his eyes wide with fear. You're nothing but a bunch of thugs. Blade's face remained stoic as he surveyed the situation. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him. We're not the ones who kidnapped a child, he said. You've crossed the line, and we're going to make sure you pay for it. The Serpent leader's eyes narrowed, his fingers twitching toward the gun holstered at his side. Blade's crew immediately tensed, ready for action. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, the sound of idling engines and the rustling of leaves the only sounds in the night. And then, as if on cue, the first punch was thrown. A Serpent lunged toward Blade, but he was quickly met with a fist to the face from Phantom, who had been waiting for just the right moment. The fight erupted in a blur of leather, steel, and the roar of motorcycles. Blade swung his leg off his bike, his boots hitting the ground with a thud as he faced the Serpent leader. Without another word, the two men collided, the force of their impact shaking the ground beneath them. Fists flew, and blades gleamed under the moonlight. The Thunder Riders were in the thick of it now, each biker battling with a Serpent in a furious dance of survival. Diesel and Storm took on two of the Serpents, their brute strength overwhelming their opponents. Crow and Inferno worked together, each taking a Serpent down with quick, precise moves. The little girl, hidden behind Blade's bike, held her breath as the chaos unfolded in front of her. She clutched Jamal's hand tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. It's going to be okay, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Jamal looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. He had never seen anything like this before. The bikers, these hardened men, were protecting him like family. As the fight raged on, Blade finally managed to get a hold of the Serpent leader, pinning him to the ground. His face was twisted in anger, but Blade's eyes were cold, filled with a calm resolve. You made a mistake, Blade said, his voice low and threatening. You tried to hurt my family, and now you're going to answer for it. The Serpent leader struggled beneath him, but Blade held him firm. You're done. Stay out of our way, and maybe we'll let you walk away. The Serpent leader's eyes burned with fury. You think you've won? He spat. This is just the beginning. We'll come for you. All of you. Blade shook his head. Not tonight. With that, he knocked the Serpent leader out cold, the man collapsing in a heap on the ground. As the last of the Serpents were either subdued or fled into the night, Blade stood up and dusted off his jacket. The battle was over. The Thunder Riders had won. But Blade knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't just the Serpents they had to worry about. There were others out there, waiting for their chance. He turned to look at the little girl and Jamal, who were standing behind him, both wide-eyed but safe. You're okay now, Blade said, his voice softening. The little girl smiled up at him, her face streaked with dirt but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Blade nodded, his eyes scanning the area one last time before he turned back to his bike. "Let's get you two home," he said. As the bikers gathered around, revving their engines one last time, Blade felt a sense of satisfaction. They had saved the day, but the road ahead would be long and dangerous, and he would be ready. The Thunder Riders had proven that loyalty, family, and justice always came first, and no one was going to take that from them. The Thunder Riders sped down the highway, their bikes roaring in the cool night air, the road stretching out ahead like an endless ribbon. Jamal and his sister, safe for now, sat close behind Blade, their eyes wide, taking in the magnitude of what had just happened. They were free, but Blade knew that this was only the beginning of a much bigger battle. The Serpents weren't the only ones who had taken notice of their actions. As the bikers moved further away from the chaos of the detention center, Blade kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, knowing that danger could be lurking just around the corner. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, seeing a message from Phantom. "We've got a bigger problem. They're organizing. The Serpents won't let this slide." Blade's jaw tightened. He had been expecting this. The Serpents were a force to be reckoned with, but it wasn't just them. Blade had seen how things worked in this world. There were always bigger players behind the scenes, pulling the strings. "What's the plan?" Blade texted back, his fingers moving quickly over the keys. Phantom's reply came almost instantly. "Meet at the old garage. It's time to regroup and figure out our next move." Blade nodded to himself, his mind already working on the next steps. The old garage was a place they had used in the past, a safe house of sorts, and it was time to use it again. "All right, everyone," Blade said, his voice steady as he spoke to the crew through the radio. "We're heading to the garage. No detours. Stay sharp. We don't know who else is watching." The bikers responded with a unified "copy that," and the convoy changed course, heading toward their destination. As they rode, the weight of the situation settled in. Blade couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. Every move they made would be watched, every decision scrutinized. But there was no turning back now. They had crossed a line, and it was only a matter of time before the retaliation came. They reached the garage, a rundown building on the outskirts of town, the metal doors creaking as they opened. Inside, the dim light from the few remaining bulbs illuminated the space, revealing the crew already gathered, their faces hard with determination. Phantom, Storm, Diesel, and the rest of the Thunder Riders stood by their bikes, waiting. "Glad you made it," Phantom said, his voice low but with a hint of relief. "We've got work to do." Blade dismounted and walked toward the group, his boots echoing in the quiet space. "What's the situation?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. "We've got intel that the Serpents aren't working alone," Storm said, stepping forward. "There's someone else behind this. Someone bigger. We're talking organized crime, Blade. This isn't just about Jamal anymore." Blade's eyes narrowed. He had suspected as much. The Serpents were too disorganized, too reckless, to be acting alone. They were part of something bigger. "Who?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. "We don't have all the details yet," Diesel chimed in, his deep voice carrying the weight of experience. "But we know they're tied to some big players in the city. People with money, power, and connections. This goes far beyond a petty revenge plot." Blade took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We need to hit them where it hurts," he said, his voice calm but fierce. "We don't have time to play by the rules. We need to take down their operation, dismantle it piece by piece." The room fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. "But we can't do it alone," Blade continued. "We'll need help, and we'll need to be smart. We have to stay one step ahead of them." The crew nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. "We're with you, Blade," Phantom said. "Let's make them pay." Blade looked around at his brothers and sisters in arms, his family. This wasn't just about the bikers anymore. It was about justice. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. "All right," Blade said, a fire in his eyes. "We make our move tomorrow. But first, we gather intel. No mistakes. And no one goes off on their own. We stay together, we fight together." "Understood. Understood," the crew replied in unison. As the bikers went to work, preparing for the next phase of their mission, Blade stood by the door, looking out into the dark night. He knew the stakes. They were up against something much bigger than they had ever faced. before, but they had each other. And that was enough. Tomorrow, they would strike back. And nothing was going to stop them. The sun had barely risen when Blade and his crew gathered around a map, the dim light from a single overhead bulb casting long shadows across the room. The garage was silent except for the soft hum of bikes being prepared for the mission ahead. Blade's eyes were hard, focused. He wasn't going to let up. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. All right, everyone. We've got one shot at this, Blade said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. We hit them hard, hit them fast, and we make sure they don't get up. The Serpents are just a small part of this. We're going after the bigger players, the ones pulling the strings. His crew nodded, their faces determined, their bodies stiff with readiness. The last few days had been a blur of planning, preparation, and sleepless nights. The bikers knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a fight for Jamal's freedom anymore. This was about taking down an entire operation. Phantom stepped forward, his face grim as he scanned the map. We've got 3 locations that we need to hit. First, we'll go after their money. The warehouse on the east side is a front. They've been laundering money through it for months. Second, we'll hit the private airstrip on the outskirts of town. That's where they're moving their illegal goods. And third, we'll go for their leaders. I've got the names of 2 of the main players. We find them, and we end this. Blade's gaze never wavered. He knew the plan was solid. But there was always the risk of something going wrong. The Serpents were a dangerous group, and the people behind them were even worse. We'll split into teams, Blade continued. Phantom, Diesel, and Storm, you'll take the warehouse. Crow, Inferno, and I will handle the airstrip. The rest of you, get ready to make your move if anything goes sideways. We hit hard and fast. No mercy. Got it, Phantom replied, his voice low but filled with resolve. The crew dispersed to prepare their bikes, checking their weapons and equipment. Blade stayed behind for a moment, his mind running through the details of the plan. He thought of Jamal and his sister, how far they had come to get to this point. They had been through hell, but they were stronger because of it. Blade wasn't going to let their fight be in vain. After a few moments of quiet reflection, he walked over to his bike, strapping his gear into place. The rest of the crew did the same, the sound of zippers and leather filling the space as they readied themselves for the fight ahead. The time had come. The Thunder Riders mounted their bikes, the low rumble of the engines growing louder as they revved to life. Blade took one last look at the crew, his eyes meeting Phantom's. This was it. No turning back. They were going to take the fight to the enemy, and they were going to win. Let's move out, Blade said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The crew roared to life, their bikes tearing through the streets as they made their way to the first location. The city was still waking up, the streets empty and quiet, but Blade knew that wouldn't last long. The Serpents wouldn't give up easily. The Thunder Riders pushed forward, their engines echoing through the streets like a warning. They were coming for the Serpents, and they weren't going to stop until the job was done. The warehouse was the first target. Phantom, Diesel, and Storm led the way, their bikes skidding to a stop in front of the large, run-down building. The doors were locked, but Phantom wasn't worried. He had dealt with worse. He pulled a crowbar from his bag, prying the door open with ease. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the empty lot. The team moved in quickly, each of them scanning the area, their senses sharp. Blade and his team were right behind them, pulling up to the airstrip. The once bustling place was now eerily quiet, the smell of oil and fuel hanging in the air. Blade motioned for his crew to spread out. They needed to move fast. The leader of the Serpents was here somewhere, hiding in the shadows. Blade could feel it in his gut. They were close. As the team moved further into the airstrip, a figure appeared from the darkness, a man in a black suit. He looked out of place, like a shadow among shadows. Blade stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. I knew you'd come, the man said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. You should have stayed out of this, Blade. You have no idea what you're up against. Blade's eyes narrowed. I know exactly what I'm up against, he said, his voice cold. And I'm going to end it. The man smirked. You think you can take down this operation? You think you can just walk in here and destroy everything we've built? Blade took a step closer, his voice unwavering. You're going to learn the hard way that you picked the wrong fight. The man's smirk faded as he reached for his gun, but Blade was faster. He drew his weapon and fired in one smooth motion, hitting the man square in the chest. The man collapsed to the ground with a final, guttural gasp. Blade's crew was already moving, clearing the area and securing the perimeter. The warehouse team had already taken control of their target, and the rest of the Serpents were scattered, fleeing into the night. The mission had been a success, but Blade knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. The tension in the air was thick as the Thunder Riders gathered around their bikes after the mission was completed. The warehouse was secured, and the leaders of the Serpents had been taken out. But Blade knew that the war wasn't over. The Serpents were down, but not out. There were still more players involved, and the fight would continue. The crew stood in the quiet aftermath, the hum of their engines the only sound breaking the stillness. Blade's mind was racing, but his body remained calm, focused. He turned to Phantom, who had been his right-hand man through it all. "What's the status?" Blade asked, his voice steady. Phantom gave a sharp nod. "We've cleared the warehouse. We've got the money, the documents, everything we need. But this is just one piece of the puzzle. The Serpents were always just the foot soldiers. We've got to go after the real power." Blade clenched his jaw. "I know. We need to hit them where it hurts." He scanned the dark horizon, his eyes narrowed. "They're going to come after us harder now. We can't afford to wait." Diesel stepped forward, his towering figure shadowed under the fading light. "I've been thinking. We hit the airstrip next, right? But I don't think. That's their main base. It's a decoy. They've been using it, but there's something bigger they're hiding." Blade's gaze sharpened. "You're right. That's too easy. They want us to think we're winning. But we're not." Storm, always the quiet one, chimed in. "I've got an idea of where they're hiding. I've heard whispers about a compound, out in the middle of nowhere. A place they've been using to stash everything, weapons, people, the works. It's off the grid. We hit that, we end this." Blade met Storm's eyes, the plan forming in his mind. "All right, we move fast. No mistakes this time. We get in, we take them down, and we get out." The crew nodded in unison, their faces set with determination. As they prepared to move out, Jamal and his sister sat off to the side, watching the bikers, their eyes full of gratitude and fear. They had been through so much already, but Blade knew this was still only the beginning. "You're going to be all right," Blade said softly to Jamal as he walked past. "We won't stop until you and your sister are safe." Jamal gave him a small nod, but the weight of the situation was heavy in his eyes. He had seen things no child should ever see. And now, with the Thunder Riders in the fight of their lives, there was no turning back. Blade mounted his bike, the roar of the engine vibrating through his chest as he revved it to life. His crew followed suit, their bikes coming to life one by one, a thunderous sound that shook the air. They rode out into the night, the lights of the city fading behind them as they made their way to the compound. The journey was long and winding, the path filled with danger at every turn. The silence between them was heavy, but each biker knew what was at stake. Blade's mind raced as they rode. He had been in countless battles, but this felt different. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about taking down a gang. This was about taking down a whole network. And if they were going to survive, they had to act fast. The compound loomed ahead, hidden deep in the woods. Blade's crew surrounded it, their bikes cutting through the trees like shadows in the night. They parked their bikes a distance away and approached on foot, moving silently through the brush. Blade's heart beat loudly in his chest as he surveyed the compound. The building was large, surrounded by high fences and guarded by armed men. This wasn't just any place. This was the heart of their operation. This was where it all ended. Blade motioned for his crew to spread out, each biker taking their position as they prepared to breach the compound. The plan was simple. Get in, take control, and take down the leaders. No hesitation. No mercy. As Blade and his crew moved into position, the tension was palpable. They could feel the eyes of the enemy on them, but they were ready. Blade's hand tightened around his weapon, his breath steady. This was it. The final showdown. The compound was silent, too silent. Blade's instincts screamed at him. Something wasn't right. And then, the sound of a door opening broke the silence. A figure stepped into view, a man in a black suit, his face obscured by shadows. Blade's breath caught in his throat. He knew this man. It was the same figure who had been orchestrating everything behind the scenes. The real power. Blade's grip tightened on his weapon. This was the man who had been pulling the strings, the one responsible for everything that had happened to Jamal and his family. And now, it was time to make him pay. The man in the black suit stepped forward, his dark figure illuminated only by the faint glow of the moonlight. Blade's heart pounded in his chest as he locked eyes with him. This was the man who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, the true leader, the one responsible for everything that had happened to Jamal, his sister, and countless others. The Serpents were just pawns in his game. Blade's grip on his weapon tightened, but he remained calm. He had been in worse situations before, but this felt different. There was something cold and calculating about this man. He was the kind of person who could destroy lives without even breaking a sweat. "You've made a big mistake, Blade," the man said, his voice smooth and cold, like ice. "You think you've won, but you've just started a war. You've taken out my people, and now you think you're going to walk away from this? You're going to regret that decision." Blade didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to listen to your threats," he said, his voice steady. "I came here to put an end to this. You're done." The man let out a low, humorless laugh. "You're so naive. You think you're the hero in all this, don't you? You think you're going to save the world. But you're just a small part of a much bigger picture. There are powers at play here that you can't even begin to understand." Blade's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" The man's smirk faded, replaced with a look of cold calculation. "You don't get it, do you? You think you've taken down the Serpents, but they're nothing. They're just one piece of the puzzle. You're fighting against something much bigger, something that has been around for years. You're playing checkers when you should be playing chess." Blade's mind raced as he processed the man's words. Was this bigger than just the Serpents? Had they been caught in a web of criminal activity that stretched far beyond what they could see? It was becoming clear that they had underestimated the situation. But Blade wasn't about to back down now. "I don't care how big you think you are," Blade said, stepping closer, his voice low and dangerous. "This ends tonight. You've hurt too many people, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The man took a step back, his expression now unreadable. "You think you're the only one with power? You think you can just waltz in here and make things right? I have resources, connections. I can make sure you and your crew disappear without a trace. You're nothing but a small-time biker gang, and I'm a part of something that will outlast you." Blade's eyes never left the man's face. "Then you better be prepared for a fight," he said. Without warning, Blade lunged forward, his fist landing hard against the man's jaw. The blow was fast, but the man was quicker than Blade had anticipated. He stumbled backward, but before Blade could strike again, the man pulled out a gun, pointing it directly at him. Blade froze, his instincts telling him to move, but the gun was too close. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the beating of Blade's heart, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself was suffocating them. Then in a flash, Phantom and Storm appeared from the shadows, their guns drawn. They had been waiting for the signal. "Drop it," Phantom shouted, his voice filled with authority. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking between Blade and the two bikers. For a second, it looked like he might try to make a run for it, but he was cornered. He lowered the gun, his hands shaking with rage. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat. "You'll never stop us. We'll keep coming, no matter what you do." Blade stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man's. "You're finished. And when we're done with you, there won't be anyone left to pick up the pieces." The man glared at him, his face twisted in hatred. "You can kill me, but you'll never kill the organization. We're everywhere. You're just one man, Blade. One man against an empire." Blade met his gaze, unflinching. "Then let's see how far your empire can go when it's already on fire." With that, Blade gave a quick nod to Phantom, who signaled Storm. Together, they moved in to restrain the man. But before they could, the man grinned. "You're too late," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll never see it coming." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook, and a distant explosion rumbled in the night. Blade's heart sank. The man had set a trap. The compound wasn't just a hideout, it was a ticking time bomb. The bikers scrambled to react, but it was too late. Another explosion followed, this one much closer, sending debris flying through the air. The man's grin widened. "You're already too late," he repeated. Blade looked around, his mind racing. They had to get out, fast. The walls of the compound were coming down around them. The Thunder Riders needed to act quickly if they were going to survive. "Move now," Blade shouted, pushing the man to the ground as he ran toward the exit. The explosion had triggered a chain reaction. The compound was falling apart. The mission had changed. Now, it was about survival. The explosion rocked the compound like a thunderclap, sending dust and debris flying in every direction. Blade's ears rang, and his body was thrown forward from the shockwave. His heart raced as he fought to regain his footing. The sound of more explosions echoed in the distance, and the walls around them seemed to groan in protest as the structure began to collapse. The man who had been so smug, so certain of his victory, was now nowhere to be seen, having disappeared into the chaos. Blade's mind raced. This wasn't just an attack on their mission. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to stop them. The compound was crumbling, and the Thunder Riders were in the thick of it. "Move now," Blade shouted as he stumbled to his feet, motioning to his crew to get moving. He couldn't afford to waste another second. The mission had just taken a deadly turn, and survival was the only thing that mattered now. Phantom, Diesel, and Storm were already on their bikes, revving their engines. Blade glanced back toward the fire that had started at the center of the compound, a burning reminder of the trap they had walked into. "Get out of here now," Phantom shouted over the noise of the explosions. "We've got to make it to the bikes and get out before the whole place comes down." The Thunder Riders moved quickly, their eyes scanning the debris as they made their way to the motorcycles. The sound of falling rubble and crumbling walls followed them, a constant reminder that the clock was ticking. Blade looked back, ensuring that Jamal and his sister were behind them. His instincts screamed to keep them safe, to make sure they got out of there alive. "Come on, let's go," Blade yelled, motioning for them to hurry. The little girl, who had been clutching her brother tightly, ran alongside him, her face pale with fear but determined. Jamal followed closely behind, his eyes wide with uncertainty but trusting in Blade to get them out of this mess. As they reached the bikes, Blade mounted his own, his hand steady on the throttle. He glanced over at Phantom, who was already leading the way, his bike roaring to life. The rest of the crew followed suit, and the convoy sped off, tearing through the debris-filled streets. The sound of their engines was drowned out by the constant barrage of explosions that seemed to be following them. Blade's heart raced as they tore through the narrow roads, weaving between burning wreckage and fallen debris. They had to get out before the entire area was consumed by fire. "We're not safe yet," Blade muttered to himself as he scanned the rearview mirror. The Serpents had set this trap for them, but Blade wasn't about to let them take the victory. He would make sure they got out alive, no matter what. As they hit the main road, Blade felt the wind whip past him, the cool air stinging his face. The familiar roar of his engine gave him a sense of focus, even amid the chaos. The Thunder Riders were a force to be reckoned with, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Ahead, the faint outline of the city began to emerge in the distance, a beacon of hope. But Blade knew they couldn't relax just yet. The Serpents would be coming after them. They weren't done yet. "We need to lay low," Blade said, his voice firm as he radioed his crew. "We can't risk being followed. Find a safe place to regroup, then we'll make our next move." Phantom's voice crackled over the radio. "Copy that. We're heading to the hideout." Blade gave a single nod, his mind already working on the next steps. The Serpents weren't going to stop. They knew who they were up against now, and they would come back with everything they had. But Blade had no intention of letting them win. As they sped through the city, Blade's thoughts drifted to Jamal and his sister. They had been through so much already. They had lost so much. But Blade had promised them he would protect them, and he was going to keep that promise. The city's skyline loomed ahead, and Blade's pulse quickened. They were almost there. The hideout was just a few miles away, and once they got there, they could regroup and plan their next move. But as they turned onto the quiet street leading to the hideout, Blade's instincts screamed at him again. Something was off. "Stop," he barked into the radio, his voice laced with urgency. The convoy screeched to a halt just as Blade caught a flash of movement up ahead. "We've got company," he said, his hand gripping the handlebar tightly. The rest of the crew quickly took defensive positions. Blade's eyes scanned the area, trying to make sense of the situation. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, a group of black SUVs sped around the corner, their headlights blinding in the dark. Blade's heart dropped. "It's them," he said under his breath. The Serpents had found them. This was the moment Blade had been dreading. They were outnumbered, but Blade wasn't going to back down. The convoy revved their engines, prepared for the fight of their lives. The Thunder Riders had fought hard to get this far, and they weren't about to lose now. The black SUVs screeched to a halt in front of the Thunder Riders, their headlights blinding in the darkness. Blade's heart raced, and every instinct told him to move fast, to take control of the situation before it spiraled out of hand. His crew had just barely managed to make it this far, and now, here they were, face to face with the enemy. The Serpents weren't going to let them off the hook so easily. The engines of the Thunder Riders' bikes roared as they revved, their riders positioning themselves for a standoff. Blade's grip tightened on his handlebars. They were outnumbered, but he wasn't about to let that stop them. "Stay sharp," Blade said into the radio, his voice calm but filled with authority. "We hold our ground. No one makes a move until I say so." Phantom, Diesel, and Storm positioned themselves at the rear, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Crow and Inferno took the flanks, ready to protect the vulnerable spots. The little girl and Jamal were already huddled behind the bikes, their faces pressed against the cold metal as they tried to stay out of harm's way. Blade wasn't about to let anyone get to them. The first SUV door swung open, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, his face hidden in shadow. The rest of the Serpents followed, spreading out in a semicircle, their hands resting on their guns. Blade's heart sank when he saw the familiar face. The man was the same one who had been pulling the strings, the mastermind behind it all. The man's lips curled into a smile, cold and calculating. "You didn't think you could just walk away, did you, Blade?" he sneered, his voice low and dripping with disdain. "This ends now." Blade stepped forward, his voice steady and unwavering. "Not tonight," he replied, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. "You're not taking anyone else. This is over." The Serpent leader's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading into a sneer. "You really think you've won, don't you?" he said, his tone laced with venom. "You've taken out my people, but you've only made things worse for yourselves." Blade's mind raced, but he didn't flinch. "You're right about one thing," he said, his eyes cold. "We're not done yet." The Serpent leader laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in the night. "You have no idea what you're up against. I'm just one part of a much bigger machine. Take me down, and there will be someone else waiting to take my place. You're not going to stop this." Blade's eyes flicked to his crew, each of them tense, ready to fight. He knew the Serpents had their connections, their empire. But this wasn't just about taking down a gang. It was about putting an end to the reign of terror they had created. "Maybe we don't stop it," Blade said, his voice low. "But we start by taking you down." In a flash, the Serpent leader pulled a gun from his jacket and aimed it at Blade. But Blade was faster. He drew his weapon and fired, the shot ringing out in the stillness of the night. The Serpent leader staggered back, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He snarled, his face twisted in pain and fury. "You'll regret that," he spat, but Blade didn't give him the chance to retaliate. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and fired again, this time hitting the man square in the chest. The Serpent leader dropped to the ground, motionless. "It's over," Blade said, his voice calm as he holstered his gun. "You're finished." The rest of the Serpents hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do now that their leader was down. Blade's crew was ready for whatever came next. Diesel stepped forward, his towering presence enough to make the remaining Serpents second-guess their next move. "You've got two choices," Diesel said, his voice low and threatening. "You walk away, or we finish what we started." The Serpents exchanged glances, sizing up the situation. They weren't fools. They knew when they were beaten. Slowly, one by one, they turned and started to retreat, their eyes still filled with anger, but recognizing that this battle had been lost. Blade watched them go, but he knew this wasn't the end. They had won this fight, but the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Let's move out," Blade said to his crew, his voice commanding. "We're not done yet." The bikers mounted their bikes and began to move, their engines roaring to life as they sped down the road. But as they made their way out of the area, Blade couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of the Serpents, or whatever bigger forces were behind them. They were a target now, and Blade had to be ready for whatever came next. The Thunder Riders had just taken down one empire, but another would rise in its place. And Blade would be ready to fight it. For Jamal, for his sister, and for everyone who had ever been hurt by the Serpents and their empire of crime. The ride back to the hideout was silent, each of the Thunder Riders lost in their thoughts. The mission had been a success, but Blade knew that the fight was far from over. They had taken down the Serpent leader, but there was a bigger force at play, and they were just getting started. As the convoy reached the outskirts of the city, Blade's mind raced. The larger organization behind the Serpents hadn't shown their hand yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they made their move. Blade pushed his bike harder, the familiar roar of the engine helping to clear his mind. He had to stay focused. Phantom's voice broke through his thoughts. "Blade, we've got movement ahead," he said over the radio, his tone steady. Blade's grip tightened on the handlebars as he scanned the road ahead. The last thing they needed was another ambush. He signaled to the crew to slow down and spread out. As they approached the hideout, the team took their positions, watching every movement around them. Blade's eyes narrowed as he noticed a black SUV parked near the entrance. "Stay alert," he ordered. "We're not alone." They approached the entrance carefully, the sound of their bikes blending with the quiet night. As Blade rolled to a stop, he motioned for the crew to dismount. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Blade could feel it in his bones. Something was wrong. "Check it out," Blade said, nodding toward Phantom and Storm. "I'll cover the entrance." Phantom and Storm moved quickly, checking the area around the hideout. Blade's eyes stayed locked on the SUV, watching for any signs of movement. His instincts told him to stay ready. After a tense few moments, Phantom's voice crackled over the radio. "All clear, but there's something else." Blade felt a knot form in his stomach. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. "It's a trap," Phantom replied. "This whole place is rigged. Someone's been tracking us." Blade's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "The Serpents," Storm suggested over the radio, his voice low. "Maybe," Blade said, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "But it's bigger than them. Whoever set this up knew we'd come here. They've been waiting for us." Blade stepped off his bike, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. "We're not walking into a trap. We need a plan." He motioned for the crew to regroup, his mind already working on their next move. The Thunder Riders gathered around him, their faces grim, but determined. "We need to make sure Jamal and his sister are safe," Blade said, his voice steady. "We'll secure the hideout, and then we'll figure out who's behind this." Diesel, the largest of the group, grunted in agreement. "We don't take chances. We hit hard, and we hit first." Blade nodded. "Exactly. No one gets left behind." The crew split into smaller teams, each assigned a task. Phantom, Storm, and Diesel would secure the perimeter, while Blade, Crow, and Inferno would check the interior of the building. Jamal and his sister were already inside, waiting anxiously for the all-clear. As Blade moved toward the entrance, his eyes scanned every shadow, every corner. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him.